This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you can hear me. We'll just wait for a few more to arrive, as we did have about 150 registrations for this, and there's only 20 people here at the moment. So we'll just give it a couple of minutes. Just give it one more minute and then we'll start. All right, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that all of us gathered here are somewhere on Aboriginal land across this vast place we now call New South Wales. I'm on Gadigal and Bidjigal lands today, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and future. I will ask that everybody that's currently on this webinar, could you please turn off your microphones? Because we're getting a lot of feedback at the moment. Thank you. So my name is Beck Dean. I'm a Senior Manager in Policy and Partnerships at Create New South Wales. And my colleague Ashley Collis is on this platform to help me moderate your questions as we go. So I do again ask that if you're not presenting, i.e. if you're not me, please turn off your cameras and your microphones so that we can focus on the information. So there is a chat box that you can open up in GoToMeetings. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a little chat bubble, which you can click, and that will open up the chat box, the chat window, and you can say hello and introduce yourselves and write down your questions in this box. And AI Media are also online and they're captioning this webinar as we go. So I think they'll be also posting the link to that in the chat box. So today we'll be talking about any changes to the public health order that were enacted on Friday. So I'm going to go through the basics of the changes. But firstly, before I do that, I did want to cover off on singing, as this is the advice that really hasn't changed since the emergence of the Avalon cluster prior to Christmas. So, sorry, could I ask those of you who just joined us if you could turn off your microphones, please, and your cameras, which would be great, thank you. So the advice that's currently in place is very similar to the advice that was throughout basically 2020, which is for indoors. The advice is that a maximum of 5 singers should be singing indoors at any one time, that they have 1.5 metres of physical distance between them, that they're all facing the same direction, and that they're positioned 5 metres from audiences or any other person that's in front of them. And in terms of outdoor settings, there isn't currently a limit on people singing outdoors. So this is causing a lot of consternation, obviously, for a range of organisations, but particularly community-based and volunteer-led organisations, because everyone will be aware that there are productions going on at the moment that have way more than 5 people on stage singing and dancing and in close physical proximity to one another. And so the issue around this is that work and the legislation around work is covered by Safe Work. And so Safe Work have developed some language or some information that you might want to utilise if you are an organisation that has at least one person in some form of employment. So if you are in this category, you're subject to workplace health and safety legislation. So you have a responsibility to manage any sort of risk in your organisation, and the way to do this through COVID-19 is through the development of a COVID safety plan. So you basically want to be limiting your risk to your performers, to your staff, and to audiences. So it might include increased physical distancing, or it might include ventilation, or a range of things that you might undertake at that time. It might include you monitoring your performers on a more kind of regular basis in terms of what they're doing and temperature checks or those sorts of things as they come into the building. So this would help you to sort of augment the work that you're doing so that you might be able to have more than 5 people on stage. And the advice after this is that you get that COVID safety plan checked by someone in risk management or in occupational health and safety or in epidemiology. So I'm getting a lot of queries from people that are basically asking me to authorise what they're doing. So at the moment, you know, as a government agent, we are sort of bound by the government advice. So the advice on singing is advice, it's a guideline, and it's not in the legislation. So this is why you're able to, you know, under those safe work guidelines, that you're able to undertake to do this work in some way if it's part of your part of the work that you're doing. So I, as a government agent, I'm not able to authorise your work. So it's basically, if you want to undertake to have more than 5 people on stage singing, or or rehearsing, or in the context in which you're working, you must undertake that risk yourselves and plan to mitigate against those risks. So I'm very open to questions at the moment, because I know there's a lot of people online at the moment who are want to ask questions about this issue. So I'm very happy to open up to questions right away so that we can cover off this issue. The other thing, I've been in very close contact with New South Wales Health about these issues, because they're getting a lot of queries, I'm getting a lot of queries. My understanding is that there is something going up to the government at the moment to address the issue of singing for this community-based and volunteer organisations. So we do expect to get some advice for this sector very soon. Morning. But at the moment, the advice remains the same. So everyone who's on here, could I please, there's a few people that are that have their microphones on at the moment. Can I please ask you to turn them off? Thank you.
Beck, we have a question from Timothy Richards asking, can you please clarify what requirements volunteer groups need to hit to be classed under the safe work rules? Do they need to have a board, for example?
You need to, basically you need to have at least one person in getting paid some kind of fee. And I think if you're a volunteer-led organisation and you're undertaking work in the context of a theatre, for instance, you might be performing, and that theatre has a COVID-safe plan to support the work that you're doing, then I think that is also something that you can undertake to do in that context. I think the muddy area is where you're potentially rehearsing or doing other forms of work that might not be covered by a COVID-safe plan in the context of a workplace.
Amy Matthews would like to know, when you say community-based and volunteer, assuming this includes school groups?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's anything that wouldn't be sort of classed as a professional organisation. The other issue is with school groups is that schools also have other legislation around them, and the Department of Education also requires certain things of the school context as well, which might be different to the information that I'm giving you. So, of course, I'm more than happy to take questions on notice and to do some research to get back to you on what the current conditions are for school groups.
So, Cressida Griffith.
Yeah, so my understanding is that the advice on singing is, I think we're in a really good spot at the moment. I think we're 28 days without a local case. And as we experienced last year when we got to a particular point in time, the advice changed and it was much more expansive in terms of the allowance for how many people could be singing inside. But I think as you've been reading the news, you've been seeing what's going on. We've got a new variant of the virus in Australia at the moment, and there's I guess a heightened sense of caution around transmission through aerosols. And that's the way that I'm reading it at the moment, and getting that sense very much back from other layers of government. So there is a bit of a heightened concern around aerosols right now. Yeah. So basically, at the moment, this is advice. It isn't in the legislation, so it's not a prosecutable kind of offence, but you need to undertake risk management if you're going to, if you're in the position as an organisation with paid staff to do this work, or if you're going into a context in which your company's being paid for the work it's doing and it's working in a professional environment, you may be able to create some mitigation that enable your work to take place. But you must understand that this is to be done at your own risk. And, you know, safe work also has the ability to I guess, prosecute organisations that might be doing the wrong thing or might be negligent in their care for their staff and other people. So it is a risk. So I tend to tell people to walk it back from the worst case scenario. What's the worst case scenario that can happen? It's like a member of your choir or your musical theatre group has COVID-19, they give it to everybody and they give it to the audience too. So what's the, you know, walk it back from that worst case scenario and do your planning accordingly. What are the things that you can do to try to make sure that that doesn't happen? But yes, my understanding is that there is a very high awareness of the grey area between professional organisations and volunteer-led organisations, and New South Wales Health are working on some information for the sector as we speak. If nobody else has any questions about singing, that they don't, and I do understand that every situation is very different. So please contact me if there's something that you want to talk through, and I'm happy to help. So let's move on. And I might go back actually, Ashley, because I wanted to talk people through the difference between public health orders and guidelines and the sorts of things that you need to be always aware of. So the public health orders are legislation. So these are basically, you can find them on the New South Wales Government website, and they will take you through everything that is legislated around COVID-19. So there's a public health order for movement and gathering. There was another public health order for mask wearing, and recently there's a public health order around arrivals from Melbourne, or people who've arrived from Melbourne or Victoria during this period of transmission. So the legislation basically provides a set of rules that are enforceable. So if you don't undertake to follow those rules, you can be prosecuted. So the one enforceable rule that I think is really important for you to acknowledge in the public health order is that it requires that you complete a COVID-safe plan that's related to a particular set of guidelines. So this is important because as the public health orders change, the guidelines also change. So you might have a COVID-safe plan that you put together in June last year, but you need to be looking at that plan as if it's a living document. So when the public health order changes, when the guidelines change, you need to be getting back in on that website and finding out what's changed and answer those questions. So it's really important that you stay on top of these changing guidelines. So the COVID-safe plan is something that you submit into the government website, as you'll be aware. Nobody is actually looking at that. But again, worst case scenario, if something happens in the context of your organisation, you need to show that you've done the work to mitigate against all of these risks within your organisation. So the COVID-safe plan will come into play for you and another person if there's an official from the police or an official from health that comes to your venue and says, have you got your COVID-safe plan? In which case you should be able to give them one that is basically up to date. So someone has asked whether the COVID-safe plan, are the guidelines enforceable, or is having a COVID-safe plan that enforces? That's my understanding, is that it's an enforceable rule. So you might have there's some questions, and I'm going over this issue because during the Christmas outbreak, there were quite a few changes that even I didn't recognise until I went through the guidelines in detail. Was that suddenly there was a requirement to keep 1.5 metres physical distance between seated groups, and that hadn't previously been in the guideline. And this is a change that's gone through all of the guidelines, so I'll get to that when we go through the specific guidelines. But it's a very difficult thing to work out when you are able to have ticketed and seated audiences up to 75%, but then you have to account for 1.5 metres physical distance between them. So you need to answer that question, but you might be answering that question saying, well, we're sold up to 75%, so we can't put physical distancing between all of our audience members and bookings. However, we are undertaking to put in place physical distancing wherever possible or whenever an audience member requests it. So those sorts of things you can deal with. But you do need to address those questions in the guideline, even if you're not able to fully comply with the advice in that guideline. Okay, so I'll just move on into, and I'll take some of these questions at the end. In terms of record keeping, I wanted to go through this as well because we did get some change which will be an enormous relief, I think, to any venue that has school groups coming in. So last year, obviously, it was kind of mandated that people need to check in digitally into venues. And since then, subsequent to that, Service New South Wales QR code has been hugely improved and is a really great tool for checking in now. I think it's the one that everyone seems to prefer. But it was still posing problems for theatres, for museums, for anyone that basically has a school group coming in. So basically health listened to you, and so there is a condition now. So for school, childcare, aged care and disability groups, the contact details only need to be collected for 2 of the group organisers. And so the group, it's then the group organiser that has to keep the record of the people that were with their group. So they need to make themselves contactable. So this has been a bit of a relief for a number of you, I believe. Okay, so now we might move on to the rest of the guidelines. So I think now we're looking at the 2 square metre rule, which we're probably familiar with for the very brief time that it was able to operate last year. So the capacity must not exceed 1 visitor per 2 square metres of space, and that children count towards the capacity limit. And it's supporting 1.5 metres physical distancing where possible, particularly at points of mixing or queuing, such as toilets at entrance and exit points, and also between seated groups. So there is a question from Matthew. I tried to explain this in the last few minutes, but we do have 75% capacity in theatres and cinemas at the moment, and there is a requirement for where possible, and that's the key phrase, is where possible, that you put 1.5 metres of physical distance between seated groups. So this isn't this is a guideline, and if you aren't able to do it at 75%, because that's quite impossible, then that is okay. You just need to answer that question in the guideline. So you need to say, if you're sold to a capacity of 75%, you need to be giving an answer to why you can't socially distance or what you're doing instead. So some organisations are continuing to mandate masks, for instance, in their venues. So where you can't, I mean, the message always from the Premier is where you can't physically distance, wear a mask. So a lot of organisations are actually doing that at the moment and continuing to make masks compulsory in venues. So it is vague. There is a desire to keep 1.5 physical distancing between seated groups, but there's also a recognition that that might not be possible all the time. Okay. So with galleries and museums and community spaces, considering time-based bookings for popular events or exhibits, and for museums and galleries, ensuring feature pieces that may attract crowds have arrangements to support physical distancing. And also in lifts, the 1.5 metre rule applies, so between groups. So if you've got more than a few people in a group, you want to keep 1.5 metres away from them. Okay, so next slide, please. So obviously there hasn't been much change to the theatres and entertainment facilities guidelines since Christmas, because over the Christmas period and into January, we were still able to keep this 75% rule. So the thing that's changed now is that we're back to 2 square metres. And again, we're looking at this difficult question of physical distancing between seated groups where possible. So I'd really like underlining the where possible there. We do know that it's not something that is possible if you're booked to capacity at 75%. Next slide. Basically the same thing with major recreation facilities. There is a sort of general desire with these major sorts of spaces that you don't sort of cluster your 75% of people up the front, and that you use that 75% across all of your stands and the layers of a stadium or a larger space. And that goes towards supporting physical distancing. So next slide. So this is the one thing that hasn't changed yet. So in Greater Sydney, the maximum for controlled outdoor events is still 2,000 people. And that's if they're assigned to a specific seat. If they're assigned to a seating area, then the maximum is 500. But everyone outside of Sydney, your controlled outdoor events are able to go to a maximum of 5,000 people. And 2,000 if they're not assigned to a specific seat, but to a seating area. So again, the physical distancing stuff is the same. Just try to make sure that there are, when you've got queuing or any places where people might congregate, that you put some measures in place to ensure that that doesn't happen. Next one, Ashley. So in indoor areas now, alcohol can only be consumed by seated customers, but my understanding is that now in outdoor areas you are able to stand and consume drinks. So if you have a function as part of your the other thing that you're doing, then you might be able to do that. If you have a function outside, you can do that in a sort of more relaxed way. Okay, so I'm going to, I think, move on to questions now. So Ashley, could you give me?
Yeah, I can. So a few of them you've addressed, Beck, but we might need to revisit for people who joined late.
Okay.
So the first question, Timothy Richards asked, how robust do our COVID safety plans need to be? Can we get a fine if we simply just have complete written into one of the boxes in the safety plan? Is this a finable offence?
I don't know. I don't think it's a finable offence. I just again urge you to walk this situation back from the worst case scenario. So if something happens at your venue, are you comfortable with giving the police something that says complete, or are you comfortable with explaining what you've undertaken to do? So I think I mean, I would be undertaking that question from a risk management perspective. So every organisation will have different risks associated with this virus. If you've been in an area that there hasn't been any COVID cases in for almost a year, then you probably feel like you're in a much safer position to say this isn't too much of a problem. We've done this work. So I would undertake to look at that from your own risk management perspective.
Is there any non-transmission target being considered by New South Wales Health? For example, if we get to X days of no community transmission, then venue capacities can go to 100%? So
the New South Wales Government does not have a roadmap or a staged kind of progression that other states have undertaken to present to the public. So I don't have an answer for that, and it's unlikely that you would get one from New South Wales Health or the Premier either.
A question from Cresta, does the 75% capacity limit for indoor venues apply to each level, for example, stalls, circle, balcony, or to the venue as a whole?
There is an expectation that you will use that 75% within the different structures of your venue. It's something I just talked about in terms of major recreation facilities. So this would go to support that sort of physical distancing, whereas if you actually just like choose to keep one area vacant and cram everyone to the front, then you're not going to be able to answer that question at all about how to keep people distant from each other.
So a question about museums and heritage sites, events at these sites. Can you clarify the rules around dance floors for religious milestones or celebrations? The example given has been a bar mitzvah. Would this fall under the functions COVID safety plan where there are no dance floors permitted? Or would this be more aligned to a wedding COVID safety plan where the immediate family members could dance?
Yeah, I'm sorry I can't answer that question. I'll have to take it on notice and maybe take your name and contact details and try to get an answer for you on that. My understanding at the moment is that dance floors aren't allowed outside of the weddings context.
Michael Blacksland has asked, our theatre serves drinks, do they have to be seated?
If they're inside, yes.
Jacques has asked, how do the current restrictions apply to community band and orchestra rehearsals?
I think that the community band and orchestra rehearsals are still in the same space that they were in last year. I don't believe there's been many changes to that. So my understanding is that there's still 1.5 metres between players, and that there is only advice on non-reeded woodwind instruments and not brass instruments, that the direction of flow from that instrument, say a recorder or a flute, needs to be 3 metres between that flute or recorder and any other person from the direction of flow.
Ian would like to know, how do the guidelines apply to ticketed events in community centres?
Good question, and I apologise I don't have an answer for that. I'm going to look into that right away and get back to you. I think the advice that there is some advice in guidelines about, so if there's a community centre that has a theatre and it's kind of recognised as a theatre, that you might undertake to do a COVID safe plan for that theatre. So there's lots of community centres, I guess, that have more than one function, but there are some that actually have very distinct spaces to them. So they might have a bar, they might have a theatre inside them, so that you would apply those specific guidelines across those spaces. But I'll find out the detail on the community centres for you and get back to you.
Caroline would like to know, do suppliers count towards the 2 square metre capacity limits at functions? For example, photographer, videographer, excluding venue and catering staff.
I think if there's someone that's being paid to work the event, they will be outside of that capacity limit.
Florence would like to know, is it worth developing a COVID safe plan now for an event scheduled in late March after the current public health orders have expired, or should we rather wait for the new orders to be released?
I think it's probably worth just drafting it now, because what will happen is things might change, but it's usually just a metric around things that are changing. So you might want to, everything else, including sort of hygiene and physical distancing, record keeping, those sorts of things, you know, for the most part, they'll stay the same, but the sort of amount that you can do might shift. So I would undertake to do it now, because it's likely to be a small change that you're enacting in March.
Brand X has asked, what is the distance between performers and audience for theatre and for dance?
It isn't covered, but I think it's just physical distancing. So I think it's just that 1.5 metres. unless you've got the singing advice through, which is 5 metres from that singer or singers.
This one might need to be taken on notice, Beck, like with the religious is dancing allowed for debutante balls. We will have to get back to you, Brendan.
Yeah, it's a sort of, it feels like a no dance floor situation at the moment, and I'll just check in on where that advice is currently at.
And Yvonne from Blue Mountains Theatre has asked, if you sell alcohol at interval in your foyer to theatre customers, must they return to their seats immediately with the drinks, or can they remain in the foyer area throughout the interval time?
If they can be seated in the foyer, they can remain in the foyer. If they can't be seated in the foyer, they'll need to return to their seats to consume their beverage.
Just one more has come through now from Craig. If we have an event that is about to go on sale but not yet sold, which rule is dominant, the 75% or the 1.5 square metre?
Okay, so you're allowed to sell at 75% capacity. That's in the public health order. You're allowed to sell at that capacity. So the guideline is where possible to create physical distancing between seated groups, but you may find that with 75% you aren't able to do that. I mean, it depends on how many people are in a booking. So for instance, if you've got a lot of people in a booking, then you might be able to create distance or a couple of seats or one seat between each group. But if you've got couples booking, then that 1.5 metres between people becomes very difficult to manage. So you just need to answer that question, that maybe you're creating gaps between groups where possible, but you might be including other mitigations. You might have made masks mandatory for your venue, for instance, as a mitigation. So you are able to sell at 75%.
We have a question about the COVID safe plans. Do you know if the templates can be updated once they've been submitted, or would you have to make changes and start again and upload a new one?
Yeah, it's not a system that you can go back into. So I would do what you're suggesting, is just create your own template, and then you can cut and paste as things are amended. So I guess the main things that will change from now on will be those sort of metrics about audience numbers and those sorts of things. So obviously, yeah, it is a pain to have to continually do that, but unfortunately, I don't think there's any other way around that issue.
Vanessa has asked, how do the guidelines apply for a festival family day event held outside but in an undercover outdoor area? Fundamentally, kids' activities like drawing. The preference is to do this as a drop-in session rather than ticketed. Capacity by clicking in and out with measures in place for physical distancing.
Vanessa, I think that sounds fine. I will get back to you on that. You would need to, people will need to sign in. So that's the other thing that you've just got to take into account, is that if they're coming into your area, that they sign in, and it also, you know, depends on how many people, that kind of thing. So I would look at the outdoor events guideline, controlled outdoor events, and that should give you most of the answers that you need, but I'm very happy to give you a hand with that advice. I also might have some colleagues in other arts organisations that have done this kind of thing before, and they've got the answers, and, you know, are happy to share it.
So another capacity question: to comply with 75% capacity in an indoor venue, would it be acceptable to have 3 rows full and then the 4th row empty and so on, or would 75% in each row be the expectation?
Again, you might decide to try to create distance between bookings rather than that 75% for each row. It's really up to you how you manage it. And it's not something that people are going to be checking on or enforcing. again, it's about this: how are you answering this question? If something bad were to happen, how would you present your case, I guess, for your venue to the authorities that might be asking you those questions? And I guess it's also, audiences at the moment are very cautious from the feedback that I've been getting from organisations. So you might actually be more often than not asked by a particular person that they want to be socially distanced from a group. So you might want to undertake to sort of leave some spaces open in your theatre so that you can move people into those spaces.
And Ruth has asked, if a guideline such as no singing indoors is ignored, are there any penalties?
I guess it's you know, it's a situation that is, it's health advice. It's not, because it's not in the legislation, my understanding is that it's not a prosecutable issue, but you might fall foul of safe work if you don't undertake to do a COVID safe plan to mitigate around transmission if something were to happen. I mean, there aren't people, you know, the police aren't knocking on people's doors seeing what they're doing inside their venues. It's more that the issue that you have to undertake the risk, and you have to know that you're undertaking a risk that's going against the advice of health.
Roz has asked, also just to clarify, for a rehearsal, we need to apply the square metre rule indoors, and how many can we have at an outdoor rehearsal?
I will just have a quick look at the music rehearsals guidelines. It depends on which guideline that you use, but I think that there is a specific guideline around music rehearsals. So I'll just have a look at that right now. If you can bear with me, I'll just bring it up. Okay, so the attendance: ensure the number of people does not exceed 1 person per 2 square metres of publicly accessible space, to a maximum of 500 people in Greater Sydney and 3,000 people outside of Greater Sydney. Attendees must be assigned to a specific seat or a designated seating area. Children count towards the capacity limit. Does that help? So that's for outdoors and indoors at the moment. It's all 2 metres, I think.
Jack has asked, can you please clarify that the public health order is enforceable, but the New South Wales health guidelines are not?
So what I tried to talk through before is that the public health order is a legislation. So that's actually the law around your activity. And so the advice is recommendations from New South Wales Health. However, in the public health order, it mandates that you must undertake to write a guideline or write a COVID safe plan against the specific guidelines that are available to you. So that is enforceable. So if you don't have a COVID safe plan that addresses a specific guideline, then that would be enforceable.
And there are no more questions.
So obviously I'm hoping to keep the sector, specifically the volunteer community-led sector, informed about about any upcoming changes to singing. So that's the thing that we'll be keeping our eyes on very closely now over the next couple of weeks. I do hope that we have an outcome for this part of the sector soon. I think Roz was just asking for a reference against the that you must have a you must address a specific guideline, and it's actually inside the public health order for movement and gathering. So basically the public health order for movement and gathering has a schedule attached to it, and in that schedule it indicates the kind of plan that you should be addressing, or the checklist that you should be addressing. So it's on page 20. I'm just going to put the public health order into the chat now so that you can have a look at it, but it's basically on page 24. It lists all of the different kinds of safety plans and the ones that you should address. And it relates to clause 7A, I think, in the public health order. Okay, so the Minister directs that occupiers of premises listed in column 2 of Schedule 1 must develop and comply with a COVID-19 safety plan that addresses the matters required by the approved COVID-19 safety checklist. So it's basically you need to match what you're doing against a plan and answer all of the questions in the checklist. Thanks everyone for joining today. If you do have any further questions around any issues, then please get in touch. So sorry, Catherine is just asking a question. There is only an outdoor rehearsal version, Catherine. I think everything else now applies. Whatever you're doing indoors, the 2 metre square rule is applying at the moment. So all of those venues that were 4 metres squared are now 2 metres squared. Yeah. Thanks very much, everyone, and stay tuned for news, and see you again soon.